Thank you very much for joining today. In today's session, we'll look into understanding the web architecture and the components.
Right.
Yesterday's section, we had a bit of practical session where we looked into setting up an environment. So we downloaded the library. So we downloaded Java version 17, which allows us to work with Java and create programs. Then we looked into IDE to install, and then we looked into online versions as well, like JDoodle. And then we wrote some simple code where we were able to print out a statement and we were able to do calculations. So Java, how Java works is that it has a very complex concept. So when it comes to Java, you need to understand object-oriented programming, where you need to understand how to work with classes, how to work with abstraction, encapsulation, polymorphism, and inheritance. So these are all behaviors of how Java works in order for us to write a clean code without errors, without writing a code which works but is very messed up. So the goal of a developer is to realize a code that has to be as readable as possible and as clean as possible. So in order for other developers to take over the project and understand what the code is about. So web development and software development, we are pretty much correlated because the main goal is to create a software or an application. So in today's session, we're going to look into web architecture. So we will introduce ISP, Internet Service Provider. We'll look into hosting, how the hosting is done through the web. Then we'll look into components, protocols. So we'll touch base on HTTP, hypertext transfer protocol secured concept. And we already looked into TCP and IP during our networking units.
Right.
And then also we look into the evolution of web technology, where we initially started with static pages with Web 1.0, then we move into Web 2.0, and nowadays we have blockchain technology, which is emerging technology and is classified as Web 3.0.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so here we have a definition of what is a website. So a group of World Wide Web pages, usually containing hyperlinks to each other and made available online by the individual, company, educational institution, government, or organization, call our toll-free number of visitor or website. So basically, a website is just simply a platform which allows us to read information and share information with other users around the globe. While the main difference between a website and a web application is that with the web application program, it is an application program that is stored on a remote server and delivered over the internet through a browser interface. So these web services are web apps by definition and meaning. Although they are not website, they contain web apps. So Zoom, for example, this software that we are using right now is a web application which allows us to interact with each other. And this is the main difference between a website, a web application. So a website is just a static page, maybe for instance, Wikipedia, where you can just read from it, while with a web application, you can interact. So for example, with Zoom, we can start meetings, we can schedule meetings, we can do many things. So this is the main difference between the two of them. I have a nice video which I want to share with you regarding the web.
So in this video, we are going to look at the basics of web application. applications. So in this video, we are going to look at the basics of web applications or how the web applications work. First of all, let's understand what's called a web application. A web application is a piece of software which can be accessed from a browser. And you know what's called a browser? A browser is an application that you use for browsing the internet. And the examples are your IE or Firefox or Google Chrome or Safari. You all know about that. Technically speaking, we can call a web application a web server, although there is a difference in the sense that a web server can host multiple web applications. But for the time being, let's call a web application a web server. And a web server is actually a network application running on some machine listening on a port. The browser is actually called a web client, or more formally, we call that a user agent. And in fact, web clients are not only browsers, but any application which can speak to a web server, like your CURL or telnet, those are also web clients or user agents. So the web client or the user agent communicates with the web server to get its job done. And for this communication, and actually for any communication, both the parties need to use the same set of rules or grammar, which we call protocol in technical terms. You got what is called a protocol? It's simple, like when two parties are communicating. For example, when two people are communicating, they need to use the same language and the same set of grammar rules so that they can understand each other. Similarly, in computer science, when two applications are communicating, they need to use the same set of rules, which we call protocol. And the browsers can speak some standard protocols, like the HTTP protocol, the FTP protocol, the WebSocket protocol. There are many protocols which the browsers can speak, and they are standards. And each of these protocols are suitable for different kind of tasks. For example, the FTP protocol is used for transferring files. And among all these protocols, the HTTP protocol is the most used protocol in the web client and the web server club. That means most of the times, the web client and the web server speak to one another using the HTTP protocol. And in fact, in this whole tutorial, we are going to focus only on HTTP protocol. So let's dig somewhat more into the HTTP protocol. To understand HTTP protocol, we need to start, or let's start with what is called a web resource, or a resource as commonly said. A resource is a document, like an HTML document or a PDF document or a JSON document or an XML file or any kind of document which is hosted by a web server, or in other words, a web client can access those documents through a web server. A resource could be either static or dynamic. A resource which does not change is called a static resource. That means it's like some static file sitting in the web server's hard disk or sitting somewhere which the web server has got access to. And when a request for a resource comes from a web client, the web server passes that resource to the web client straight. In contrast, a dynamic resource is generated on the fly, in the sense that when a request for a dynamic resource comes from a web client, the web server builds the resource on the fly. For example, suppose a web server has a resource which embeds the current time, either in a JSON or some XML document or an HTML page or whatever. So when a request for that particular resource comes from a web client, the web server gets the current time from the system and puts that into a JSON document and builds a JSON document or an XML document or an HTML document, embedding that particular time into it, and then it sends back that document to the web client. Each resource on the web in the world is identified by a unique URL, which is actually a unique string. It would be more clear when we look at an example. So this is an example of a URL which points to a unique resource in the world. And this part of the URL is the protocol, and this part identifies the web server in the world, and this is the path of the resource in the web server. We will talk about URL more in some later video. Let's go back to HTTP now. So, HTTP protocol is basically a request response protocol. That means whenever the web client needs to do some operation on a resource, like reading it or updating it or deleting it or creating a new resource or any kind of operation, the web client first establishes a connection with the web server where the resource is hosted, and then the web client sends a request to it. The request contains the details of what the web client wants, like which operation it wants and all. While the web server receives a request, it responds with a response back to the web client. That means it sends a response back to the web client. And the content of the response depends on what was requested. For example, if the client asks to read a resource, the server can either put the resource in the response or inform the client that the resource is not available with me and you go to somewhere else for the resource or something like that. And then after the response is given to the web client,
Hello. I think I had a problem with my connection.
It's okay.
Were you able
I
to
think
see the
I
video?
get the idea. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know what happened with this. Can you see my screen?
No.
To get the presentation. Hello. There is something wrong with my connection. It keeps logging me out. 1 second. Give me 1 sec. 1 second.